Thank you, Elena. Thank you for inviting us. I hope I will be at least half interested as Danilo because this is really about the legal and policy stuff, which, looks a bit boring at the beginning, but if you see one step further what actually that means to business, I think that basically anyone who is dealing not only with the cloud, but I would say overall with the business in Europe should be in a way kind of mindful what's going on. So I would like to cover basically 6 basic areas here, as you can see on the screen. First, European Cloud Initiative, at least from the point of view of digital industry and a lot of basically big cloud providers, including Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft, and then a lot of SMEs as well that are our members. Standards, platforms, free flow of data, data protection, cybersecurity. You will see that especially the 3 last ones are somehow connected and, let's say, intertwined together. Just perhaps one word about Digital Europe, because most of you most likely don't know exactly who we are. So we are basically the biggest ICT trade association in Brussels. We are having about 60 corporate members that are basically all, we can say, household names coming from basically every part of the world. Plus we have also 37 national trade associations, including 2 from Romania as members. And this basically means that we have a lot of small companies, SMEs, micro SMEs as our members, not perhaps directly, but indirectly working with us. So basically about European Cloud Initiative. I will be very short about this. You heard a lot from the European Commission yesterday, so I don't think I need to basically repeat what it is. The point for us is that it's a very good initiative. The objectives are very good. What we are a bit missing compared to what happened in 2012 and the European Cloud Communication there, that was a bit more focused on uptake of the cloud, some sort of awareness raising, and helping basically the member states to understand what is the cloud and how they can get the most benefit out of the cloud. Here, this is at least what we see. Again, good objective. It's focused on the research. It's focused on building research infrastructure. That's good. The only thing is that we see a bit of disconnect with this other part, and that's actually how this will come at the end to the citizen. And that's at the end the point of the whole thing. It's great to have it for the research. Yes, it's needed. The only thing is that how this all will somehow transform and come back to the citizen. That's our kind of question that we have. We were in a discussion with the European Commission to see basically what can be done in their way. What they told us is that they would like to see industry involvement in a sense of building infrastructure and providing hardware and perhaps services built on this. But that was pretty much about it. What I think it's still also needed is more work with the governments, actually, how they will get there and use basically cloud to make it closer, all these services based on the cloud to the citizens. Next one, hopefully. Okay. Standards. Now you may say, why standards? How standards are related to cloud? Standards are related basically to everything. So whatever you have here, this basically cup, chair, everything is basically based on some sort of the standard, either because of the product safety or for various other reasons. It is based on the standards. So standards also goes to the cloud and cloud services, both for the infrastructure part and services part. And now you may say, okay, but why is it now important? Well, it's important because Commission came out with also standards communication, which was published at the same time as European Cloud Initiative. And the point there was that there is a lot of talk about how standardization should look like in Europe and what should basically be used and as a basis not just for the cloud, but for various sectors there. What basically we have as a message as an industry is that whatever already exists and whatever already works and has some sort of the global nature should be considered and used and not somehow being reinvented in Europe just to say, okay, this is now European and now we will work in Europe. Why? Because if you see the nature of cloud services, digital services, it's somehow, borderless by definition, right? So wherever basically you go, if you are using, let's say, cloud service, I'm having it on my device, I'm using wherever I go. So borders doesn't mean much. Therefore, if you have something that already works and there is a lot of global standards and specifications, if there is no particular need to invent something in Europe, then let's not invent it, and then let's focus on other things that can bring more value than just, you know, some sort of the work on the standards, so that we can prove that we have something that we can just put a seal saying that's European, right? What I think that we can put as a seal of European is basically how we use it and what we are making out of it, not as we put this as some sort of the stamp European. So at the moment, I think Commission did a good job in a sense of identifying what will be the areas of basically developing of standards. That's very good. And if it goes in this direction, that's okay, because there needs to be some sort of the priorities. If I remember correctly, cloud was not so particularly mentioned there as one of the verticals, because you can also consider cloud as some sort of the kind of horizontal basis for many of the applications there. But indirectly, definitely, it was there. So our kind of key message is basically keep what works, continue working within the global community, and don't invent what just don't need to be invented, what is already there. Platforms. So you can say, okay, why platforms? Platforms are basically something that we are now using in our everyday life almost basically every time. So platforms are from let's say e-commerce platforms to basically any other platform that you can imagine, and most of them are actually powered by the cloud services. If we go back to this, why we believe this is important? It's important because there was a lot of questions about basically power of certain platforms, especially in B2C area, and the questions there were, you know, what should we do with the platforms? Do they need to be regulated? If yes, how? And how to approach basically their, what you can call it is a market power, market dominance. For businesses outside of the Europe, they may also face some sort of the local restrictions. So I will give you my favorite example from Peru. There was a public tender in Peru for basically providing cloud basically based services for education, so for public education. And the requirement was that all the data must be stored in Peru. And when the European companies were asking, okay, but why are you requiring this? This shouldn't be the case, because also basically from the security grounds as well. The more you have distributed data, in principle, it should be more secure than only stored in one place. What the government says is, what you Europeans want, you are doing the same thing in your countries, go back and check what you are doing, then come back and tell us what we should do, right? So the thing is that if you want to have a global business go outside of the Europe, and then you face some similar restrictions, that is not necessarily good for the business, but it could come up from our own practices. So what the Commission is trying to do now is to have so-called free flow of data initiative, which would come out in November this year, which in our view is very good, because it should lead to very clear communication to the member states that these practices, unless they are really based on either national security concerns or on some very sensitive data like health records, shouldn't be basically required, then data must be stored in a certain place or in a certain region. And this is all okay if it is written in the law, because then European Commission can apply basically principles of the EU law and say, okay, why are you doing this? Perhaps this is against the single market principles. The thing is that you have a lot of practices which are coming just as a practice, so it's kind of non-written law. Example is public procurement. So you may have a public tender based on from some public authority, which will come and say, okay, for these type of the services, this data must be stored here, right? Wherever that here is. And this is then much harder to trace and much harder to basically avoid. Why? Because it's nowhere written. It's just one example, right? So let's see what Commission will come out. At least what we know is that there will be no legislation, which is not necessarily important, but important is to send the clear message that this is some of the practices that shouldn't be basically happening within the internal market. And then again, additionally, when as a Europe we are communicating and exchanging with other parts of the world, it's very hard to ask them to apply certain principles that Europe is not applying on itself, right? So that's the point of this there. Next one is also one of the favorite topics, and that's general data protection regulation. I think Michaela had one of the questions that are very much related to this legislation. And for some of you that may know more about this, This is one of the legislation that was, as far as I know, it took almost the longest period, as far as I could remember, to be adopted in the EU, besides unitary patent, which took 40 years. This took 4 years to be adopted, and then there will be another 2 years now to implement in the member states. And here the thing is that it all came from the very good basis and very good fundamentals, which means that the privacy of the citizens is a fundamental right and needs to be well protected. And that's great, and no one is ever questioning this principle. The other thing is that having in mind also digital world and what is happening with the many applications coming from the digital world. Danilo was making great examples, which are not the only ones, but we can add to these examples also the things like research, especially medical research, right? Which is basically usually based on a large sets of data. The truth is that some of the provisions from this proposal, or actually now basically the law, may be interpreted in a way that does not allow actually this type of the research to be properly done in Europe. Which means it's either then taken out and done outside of the Europe, or it's not done in Europe at all. So that, I think, was definitely not the purpose of the legislation. That was not the main idea, but it could be some of the unintended consequences there. The other thing which is also a bit questionable is the idea was to have some sort of the one harmonized EU approach on data protection. And that was great. We had directive. Directive is 20 years old. Basic principles are still valid. But the thing is that you also had very different interpretation and implementation in the member states of the directive. With regulation, that shouldn't happen because there is no need for particular, let's say, copy-pasting in the national laws, but basically you can apply the regulation. What happened is that you have something like 44 so-called carve-outs, which means that every member state can choose any of these 44 carve-outs and do something specifically for that country. So this is theoretically, purely mathematically, 28 times 44 variations of the legislation. Now, how can you basically run the business in Europe, especially cloud-based business, which is absolutely borderless, if you have 28 times 44 possible exceptions? Or let's say different interpretations of the same rule. Same rule, different interpretation. Now, Commission is trying to work on this, and the future European Data Protection Board should work on it. But you already have some countries, and even some regions in some countries, like in Germany, basically their Länder, which has 16 different data protection authorities, because they do not have the central one, they're a federal country, that are passing, their own opinions on many of these issues in one country. So what can you expect in 28 countries? So this is what I think is a concern for digital business, because, like I said, it is a borderless business, and it's very hard to imagine how this very complex and very sensitive regulation will work with that possibility of interpretations, which, by the way, is much, much worse than any implementation of the existing directive, right? So that much about this. And of course, for us, basically, so basically for us, what is a key thing as I would say ICT industry, and especially for SMEs, is how this will be interpreted and how this will be basically implemented in the member states. How this is related to the free flow of data. It is in a way, if you combine it with international data transfers, which are also part of this regulation. And perhaps you heard about so-called Privacy Shield or ex-Safe Harbor, which was the separate special decision from the European Commission, which actually set the rules how the data should be transferred between the US and the European Union. Now this was renewed this year and strengthened and somehow harmonized with this legislation. The thing there is that if you really want to expand your business and do business beyond Europe, you need international data transfers. And the point of these decisions was that for the data of European citizens that would be transferred outside of the EU, the same or adequate level of protection is guaranteed in the place outside of Europe. And that's very good. But the thing is, there is no absolute security and data must flow. There was the one famous movie which says, spice must flow. I would say data must flow. And you can't stop it. which means that if you don't have the rules that are applicable, what will happen with data economy? And this is what I think it's very important to understand, and that goes for cloud and basically all, I would say, data services. Next one is so-called e-privacy directive. So e-privacy directive is another piece of legislation that was basically passed in 2002 first time, then revised in 2009, and it was primarily envisaged at that time for the telecom operators for two reasons. Mainly to ensure the confidentiality of communications. So basically what we are at that time talking basically over our phones, and a bit on the cybersecurity thing. So if there is any network incident, how to handle this, how to report this, and so on. Partly it was used for another topic which is also relatively popular, and that's so-called data retention for the purposes of the law enforcement and basically for the secret services. And now the time has come that this piece of legislation is revised. Our initial reflex was that if you have general data protection legislation, and if you have the cybersecurity legislation that I will cover a moment after, why would you need a third instrument that was basically only telco oriented? But Commission thinks that this is necessary, so we will see what will happen. What we are fearing again is a bit of an overlap between the general data protection regulation and cybersecurity regulation coming from the third instrument. Let's see how Commission will play this. We expect this by the end of the year, but this is, I would say, a major concern. Now you would say, why is all the decent is just in all legislation? The thing is that all this legislation comes to all the member states, and then they need to implement it. So if you do not have a clear idea why this is happening, what needs to be achieved, and you're just blindly copy-pasting what is coming there, that's not, I would say, the best possible... Time is up? Or? Yeah? This? Okay. Let me just go then skip to the, I think, last one, and that's cybersecurity. Okay. So this is the last piece of legislation. This is also already adopted. And the thing there is that this is the first piece of the cybersecurity legislation in Europe, which is very good. Now again, we have the question how to implement this. So what we try to do is, and why is this important for the cloud? Because this is the first time that actually cloud providers are specifically identified as so-called digital service providers that may fall under the cybersecurity requirements. They are less burdensome than, for example, for the energy sector or the finance sector or health sector, which is considered as a critical infrastructure, but still is defined and something needs to be done. So what we developed basically some sort of the guidance that we translated in various European languages, and that we are basically going and evangelizing with the member state governments to try to help them to understand what is digital service provider, what are the cloud services, how they're working, and to make sure that this is then implemented in a proper, harmonized way, basically across the Europe, and making sure that the cloud services actually can deliver what they should deliver. So that, I think, it's a kind of short overview, at least, what is going on now in this famous policy arena. Thank you.